Alright, I am back with another video, and today I wanted to try something a little bit different. I wanted to try my hand at making a stealth barbarian. Now usually those two things don't necessarily go together. Barbarians are loud, proud, frontline fighters, and your more stealthy characters such as rogues and rangers, they don't really want to be at the forefront. They want to be doing damage from the backline. They want to be sneaking up on people for big single burst damage. So how exactly do these two naturally intertwine? Well, in Baldur's Gate 3, there's a lot of things you can do if you want to go down this route. There's obviously the option that Rogue's Sneak Attack does work with Barbarian's Rage, since, compared to Tabletop, Rage is not tied to Strength. You can actually use it with Dexterity-based attacks, which we'll be taking advantage of in this video. But this is not a Rogue build. No. I wanted to do something a little bit different. I was inspired by multiple different factors, but one that actually caught my interest here was the Panther Wild Shape, oddly enough. Now, this isn't a druid build either, but the way that the Panther Wild Shape works with its ability to turn invisible, stalk from the shadows, and then suddenly come out with a flurry of blows, especially if you're a full-level moon druid, was really interesting to me, and I thought it could create an interesting dynamic for the kind of build that I was going for. I also ended up kind of unintentionally tying this build into the lore of the Harpers, and specifically Jaheira herself. I think this character could actually be like a member of the Harpers who was a direct apprentice under Jaheira, learning various different things, adapting a new Panther fighting style based on her iconic wild shape. In addition to that, this character also kind of has a serious anger issue, hence the barbarian levels, but they're learning to channel that anger into something productive and useful, rather than just wildly swinging about. So the idea, again, of this character is to stealth into a situation, get into a prime position, and then just launch themselves into combat with a flurry of blows, rage immediately, and just start going absolutely ham. Basically getting to make a lot of attacks in a turn, being extremely tanky, and then also taking advantage of some unique abilities here and there. And honestly, the build that we've managed to come up with today, well, me, is actually super fun. And with the way the stats work out, this build is highly, and I mean highly, customizable. You are going to have so many different options. We've got a completely free feat by the time we get to the end of this build that you can use for whatever you want. We're going to have a really solid stat spread, which is going to make, and some skill proficiencies that are going to make us amazing as the face of the party as well. This character is actually going to be really great to feel, like to play and feel like you are the protagonist of the game when you're playing this as Tav. So actually, I really think this build exceeded all of my expectations in terms of being a well-rounded, powerful, yet fun to roleplay character. So I really hope you guys enjoy this one. It was an absolute blast to make and play, so yeah, let's get right into the build. To kick things off, we're going to be playing as a drow, one of my favourite races in the game. This is going to give us a few things, namely some innate racial spellcasting. We're going to get dancing lights, which isn't great. We're never ever going to use this, but that's not really the point. We're going to get the standard base racial movement speed. We're going to gain proficiency with rapiers, short swords, and hand crossbows, which we don't need since we'll be starting off as barbarian anyway, but, you know, it's nice to have in case you want to change up some things here or there. Moving on, we also get superior dark vision, which just kind of made sense for this build. Again, we're a stalker from the shadows, we're a stealthy character. Being able to use, like, darkness to our advantage just kind of made sense with this build. So superior dark vision feels great here, as well as your typical Fey ancestry, giving you advantage on saving throws against being charmed, and not allowing you to be put to sleep by magic. Obviously, I've gone with a Celadon drow because we are one of the good guys. We're not a love-sworn evil drow, although if you wanted to start off that way, you absolutely could. Honestly, you can play either or. There's no mechanical difference other than like maybe a few dialogue options here and there, and like a cleric deity option, but I did go with Celadon because we're meant to be, you know, one of the ones who has come out of the Underdark and is not inherently, you know, in service to Lolth. So yeah, we went with Celadon this time. Kicking things off, as I said, we're going to be a barbarian to start with. This is going to give us access to a few things, like simple and martial weapons, light medium armor, and shields. We're going to be wearing medium armor for this build, as you can tell, so we definitely wanted to make sure we started off with this, but you can start this off with either barbarian or our other class that we're going to be multiclassing into. It doesn't really matter, although I did want to multiclass into our following class later for item spell save DC and all that. If for those of you who have played BG3, you'll kind of know how that works, but I'll go into more detail about it later. So overall, we mostly want to start with Barbarian. This is going to give us access to our Rage, allowing us to deal an extra 2 damage with melee and improvised weapons, as well as throwing attacks, and also will gain resistance to physical damage and advantage on strength checks and saving throws. I mean, it's basic Rage, nothing too crazy yet. We're also going to get unarmored defense, but we're not really really going to be using it with this build, but with the way our stat spread does work out, you will be able to get a solid 18 AC out of your unarmored defense without before any like different buffs and modifiers, so unarmored defense is absolutely a viable option on this build. Moving on to our ability scores, this is a pretty standard spread for a dexterity-based character, although there is a bit of an anomaly here. Dexterity is at 17, we're going to be bumping this up with a half feat later. Constitution is at 16, this is a pretty solid level for the build. It's going to give us a decent amount of HP and good concentration saving throws, even though we're not really going to be concentrating with this build because of rage, but we do have some concentration-based spells that we could take advantage of if we want to. Intelligence is at 8, we don't really need it. Wisdom is at 13, we're going to be bumping this up with an item later. And Charisma is at 12 for those awesome Barbarian Charisma checks. If you've not played a high Charisma Barbarian in Baldur's Gate 3, absolutely do so, because they are hilarious to play. The Barbarian Intimidation checks are just so fun in this game, which is why I wanted to make sure we at least had a decent amount of Charisma, but that can be thrown into other things if you so choose. However, I will note, not a lot of people know this, Barbarian's spellcasting modifier, because they do have to have one, is Charisma. So there you go, it makes sense to have a little bit of charisma. Moving on to our skill proficiencies, I went with the Urchin background to give us sleight of hand and stealth. Both skills that I want. Obviously we're going to be a stealthy infiltration character when we're not in combat, so we definitely wanted to make sure we had those skills, and the Urchin background was the best for it. Of course, that can tie into the idea of how this character ended up joining the Harpers. Maybe they were homeless walking the streets, you know, saw the efforts and bravery of the Harpers and ended up joining, and maybe even got raised by the Harpers. Maybe they were very young when this happened. You know, there's a lot of cool things you can do with that kind of backstory. Moving on, because we're a drow, we also gain perception, which is great for us. Very happy to have that here. This build is very efficient with its skill proficiencies, which I absolutely love. So I've gone with survival and intimidation for our chosen checks for Barbarian. Obviously, survival just makes sense for a kind of wilderness-based build like us. Again, we do have some kind of like outlander, rangery, druid type aspects to us. Again, we'll get to that in a minute. As well as intimidation, again, for those aforementioned Barbarian intimidation checks, because they are so fun. So yeah, overall, pretty solid skill proficiencies and a really good stat spread, at least in my opinion. Now, at level 2, you have a choice. You can either keep going to level 5 of Barbarian before you do any multiclassing, just to make sure you have extra attack, or you can do what I would probably recommend for this build and multiclass now, go 5 levels of our multiclass, and then respec at level 9 to go back to that level 5 of Barbarian. Again, it all makes sense when you see the full build spread out. So we're going to do that now, and we are multiclassing into Ranger. Yeah, we're not doing rogue levels today, as I did say earlier. Now, the main reason for this is because while rogue obviously would give us sneak attack, and we could do things like thief rogue or assassin rogue or whatever, which would all make sense, I ended up finding that, again, for the kind of vibe that I was going for, you know, like the kind of Panther inspiration and all that, Ranger actually did make a lot of sense. It's going to give us a ton of utility options, as well as a particular ability that I really want to make use of, as well as a bunch of cool other things that we'll be able to grab. So while Rogue can absolutely work here, in fact I think Assassin would just be so fun to play with this build, so I would say give that a go if you want to, we are going to be playing a Ranger today. First up, we get to choose a favoured enemy. Now, we kind of have everything we need. A lot of these things will actually be somewhat redundant on this build, so basically just pick one that's going to give you a skill proficiency that you would like. Bounty Hunter would give us proficiency in investigation, but we're not going to be using ensnaring strike, so the second part of that passive is basically completely useless to us. Keeper of the Veil will give us proficiency in Arcana and protection from evil and good, which is fine until we rage and it goes away. Magebreaker would also give us proficiency in Arcana and True Strike. Need I say more? Ranger Knight. We won't be able to use heavy armor with this build, but it will give us skill proficiency with history, so you could go with that. And Sanctified Stalker would give us proficiency in religion and the Sacred Flame cantrip, which is cast with our wisdom. To be honest, this is the one that we have any chance of getting some usage out of. Religion is something that you can just have worldly knowledge of, even if you're not religious yourself, for example, and Sacred Flame does use our wisdom to cast, so there is a chance it could be used, but honestly we're mainly just here for the religion proficiency, which does come up a bit more than you would think. Moving on, we have Natural Explorer. Now, if it wasn't for the Urchin background, I would be taking Urban Tracker here for proficiency in Sleight of Hand, but with the Urchin background, we don't have to. So we've got a few options here. We can go for Beast Tamer to give us Find Familiar, which is always fun to have, or either go for Resistance to Cold, Fire, or Poison. Now, personally, I think any drow gaining Poison resistance does kind of make sense in my opinion when you consider their lore and kind of their expertise in crafting poisons, but obviously Fire and Cold are much more common damage types. I did take Wasteland one Wanderer fire in my testing, but I didn't really fight many enemies that had fire attacks, so it didn't really end up making a huge difference. So it's honestly a pick your favorite situation. Honestly, I love Find Familiar in a lot of situations. It's just such a fun and flavorful spell to have to go throughout the game with. So for fun factor, that would be my personal recommendation, but for pure power, you're definitely going to want to go for one of the Wasteland Wanderers. Again, for lore reasons, I love the idea of going with poison, so I'm going to be picking that. We also do get 2 skill proficiencies here. Obviously, we do just get the aforementioned proficiency from our favourite enemy feature, and we do just get to pick another one for free. Now, it's entirely up to you what you want to grab here. Nature obviously does make sense for us, but I did end up going with Insight, because again, we do actually have a lot of kind of like a party face thing going on here. Again, not the most effective, but we have so many different skill proficiencies that we're going to be good in a lot of different situations, and so Insight, again, when we are talking to people, just kind of makes sense to me, so we're going to go with that. Moving on to Ranger level 2, we're going to get a couple more things that I really want for this build. Namely, we're going to get a couple of spells. Now, again, we're not going to be able to concentrate on things while raging. So we are going to have to pick some utility options, and the 2 utility options I'm going to go with for now are Longstrider and Enhanced Sleep. There's going to be actually a theme of like using jumping to gain distance with this build. We're going to have a lot of movement speed here, and the ability to be able to jump around and get to favourable positions and just maneuver around the battlefield basically completely freely is going to be a really fun aspect of this build in combat, and Enhanced Sleep cast at the start of combat is actually really going to help with that. We're also going to gain a ton of different ways to be able to jump across the map, like through some stuff we're going to be getting later, and Longstrider is also just going to give us a bunch of movement speed as well. So between these 2 spells, we're going to be zooming across the battlefield. No enemy is going to be safe from our melee attacks. And we also get to choose a fighting style, another reason I wanted to go with Ranger, because there's 3 fighting styles here that are actually going to be extremely useful, although we can make use of all 4 of them with this build. 2-weapon fighting is what I'm going to be using, as this is a dual-wielding build, allowing us to add our ability modifier to offhand attacks. This is extremely good for us. Again, this is a dual-wielding build, but when you kind of get to the end game, you don't actually need to use 2-weapon fighting anymore. You could actually use some other things. You could go for dueling, defense, or archery, but 2-weapon fighting does feel like more what I kind of wanted to go for with this build. I just love dual-wielding characters, and I like the idea of the Panther having its fangs, or its claws, so to speak, you know, like having 2 pointy weapons. You get what I mean, right? So I'm going to be going with 2-weapon fighting today, but really there's room to take any of these on this build, so pick your favourite. We're also going to be getting Fairy Fire at this point, which is a fun spell to have. At Ranger level 3, we get to choose our subclass, and if it wasn't obvious by this point, we're playing a Gloomstalker. Gloomstalker is going to give us a ton to work with here. It's going to give us Dread Ambusher, which is going to give us an extra attack on our first turn, plus a big bonus to our initiative. One of the things I sometimes struggle with when making Barbarians is when I kind of make their dexterity a bit lower, they don't get a chance to rage early on, meaning that they struggle with taking a lot of hits before they rage and become resistant and a bit more tanky, meaning that they could take a lot more damage than they need to. We will have so much of an initiative bonus with this build that we will be guaranteed to go first in any encounter, meaning that we'll be able to get off a big dollop of damage right off the start with 3 attacks thanks to Dread Ambusher and our 2 regular attacks. Then, but after doing our initial attack out of stealth, because of course we'll do a stealth attack first, do a stealth attack, then rage, then Dread Ambusher, then extra attack. So you're going to have a lot of attacks in the first turn, you're going to have a ton of movement speed, and you're always going to go first and be able to rage to get that extra damage and resistance. That's kind of where that synergy comes into play. So I really, really like this kind of combination of Barbarian and Gloomstalker. They have way more things that work together than you initially think. If you're not playing a Drow, you also gain superior dark vision at this point, so you don't have to play a Drow with this build. We're also going to get the ability to hide as a bonus action here, which can come in useful sometimes, but I think usually when you're in the thick of it as a Barbarian, you're just going to keep swinging. But if you want to make it so that like you can kind of back out of combat, like you absolutely can. This is quite a fun ability to have that may come up in niche situations. But another ability that's really fun here is Umbral Shroud. Wrap yourself in shadows to become invisible if you are obscured. Now this is kind of playing on that theme of the Panther again and its ability to turn invisible. So we can just basically back up into the shadows even while we're still raging, become invisible, and then sneak up on our target for another big attack. This is kind of like a fun little, mostly flavorful but also somewhat mechanically advantageous gameplay loop, but I think just makes this build feel so interesting to play. Now, the big ticket hit thing here, though, is that it costs an action to do. And if we use an action, we can't attack, and if we can't attack, we lose our Barbarian's Rage. But that's why we're dual wielding. Because we can still make an attack with our bonus action, we can go stealth, move to where we want to be without interruption, and then bam, get off a bonus action stab, still getting the full damage, and then being able to not lose our rage as well. So all of these abilities with this particular playstyle do synergize quite nicely. And finally, Disguise Self, more of a flavor option, but again, since we're the face of the party, with our charisma and our skill proficiencies, we can actually make quite a lot of use of Disguise Self here, so I quite like it. Moving on, we do get to choose another spell, and we've kind of got everything I want. We're not going to need to grab Speak with Animals here, because we will get it as a racial feature, not a racial feature, a subclass feature later on. You could take it now if you're following this level progression just so you have it, and then respec it out later, but we can go over the various options that we have. I mean, obviously we can't cast any spells while ranging, so the usual, like Ensnaring Strike or Hail of Thorns are kind of out. I do have the Mistress Spell mod, which gives us something like Zephyr Strike, but that is concentration, so it's not going to feel as useful. Absorb Elements is a reaction-based spell, and in theory, barring patch 8 doesn't fix this, it can be cast while raging, so that you could find some usage there. So maybe that's worth taking, but at the end of the day, we all just love a good snack, don't we? Good Berry is actually a surprisingly effective spell on this build. Because you can cast it and it's just an item that stays in your inventory, you can eat these while raging and still gain the healing. Also, they just create camp supplies that you can consistently use, so there's not really a reason not to take this. If you have some spell slots left at the end of the day, just cast this spell over and over and get some food going. And at range level 4, we're going to gain access to darkness, so we do have that to make it so we can be always obscured if we need to. Even though we're not going to get the immunity to the blinded effect, we'll have so many ways of giving ourselves advantage, but actually that blindness is going to be completely irrelevant to us. What you can use blindness for, or darkness I should say, for on this build, is that you can use this to set up a tricky situation. Maybe you can't quite get the exact angle you want to for your stealth, but with this you can darkness, jump into the darkness, and then get the drop on the enemies that way. Yes, it's only once per long rest, but that's all you should really need to use it for. It's not a cornerstone of the build, it's just a useful utility option that when you have a chance to use it and have it be useful, then it will be. So again, I think Drow is pretty much the best race for this build for these reasons alone. Maybe Half-Elf Drow could also work, but Drow gets the dialogue options and Half-Elf Drow doesn't. So, you know, I think playing a Drow here is much more interesting. Moving on to our feats, we are going to be taking a half feat to bump up our dexterity. Now, if you have the Tasha's Feats mod, which I recommend since it's available on all platforms, the Slasher feat here does feel very much at home. You can bump up your dexterity and make it so that you can halt enemies with your slashing attacks. So overall, and even maybe make it so their attack rolls have disadvantage. Overall, a very solid feature. But playing more into what we've been going on about, you know, with like the jump speed and maneuverability and all that, I think Athlete is a solid pick here. You're going to be able to increase your jump distance by 50 feet, and when we are knocked prone, we can stand up using significantly less movement. Basically, with all the abilities that we're going to be gaining on this build, even though we have only an 8 in strength, our jump distance is going to be pretty damn immaculate between Enhanced Sleep, this, and another ability we'll be getting later. So overall, I really like this one. I think it makes sense for this build, so I want to grab it. Now, I would say if you are playing through the game with this build, you're going to take level 5 of Ranger here. It's going to give you extra attack, level 2 spells like Misty Step, and also something like Pass Without Trace to make the whole party stealthy, but I think once you get to level 9 or 10 of this build, you're going to want to respec into the final build that I will have available at the end of this video. So I'm not going to be showing off level 5 of Ranger here that much, just know that this is what you can kind of work with. I'm going to be showing off the final build here. So we're going to be going back to Barbarian. This is going to give us access to Danger Sense, giving us advantage on dexterity saving throws against traps, spells, and surfaces. Very, very nice. We're much less likely to slip on ice. We take less damage from Fireball. And traps, while specific, are still nice to have. I like the idea of this being kind of like a feature that we have, again, like the kind of Panther's acute senses. Again, it all kind of plays on the theme that we're going for. As well as reckless attack. We're going to have such a high AC that reckless attack is actually going to feel kind of bad to use with this build, because by the time this build is done, we're going to have about 22 AC, but with reckless attack, we're still going to be taking those hits anyway. Yes, we resist a lot of that damage, but we still kind of want to be avoiding taking hits where we can. So this is basically a don't use it all the time feature, but if the prompt comes up and you really need that attack to land, then pop it. So you can use it pretty much whenever you want to, but just know that you are going to be taking more hits if you do, and this build has the ability to avoid damage entirely if you want, so it's definitely the double-edged sword that it is designed to be, at least on this build. And at level 3 of Barbarian, we get to choose our subclass. Now, I would say any of these could work. Wild Magic, maybe not fitting the theme of the build, is available, you know, it does give you some buffs. Berserker absolutely can work, giving you throwing attacks and an extra bonus action attack if you want it, but we are dual wielding, so this doesn't quite synergize as well. I mean, if you decide to ditch the dual wielding, then this can absolutely work, but again, playing onto this kind of nature ranger theme that we have going on, we're going to be jumping over to Wildheart. Wildheart is going to give us speak with animals, so we didn't need to take it as ranger, and we get to choose a bestial heart. Again, pretty much any of these will work. Eagle heart will synergize with our jumping shenanigans quite well, but I wanted to go with the tiger heart today. Again, we're going for kind of like a panther theming here, and tiger is the closest we can get, but it still does kind of synergize with what we're trying to go for. It increases our jump distance while raging, which again synergizes with all our other abilities, but we're also going to get the Tiger's Bloodlust feature, allowing us to slash up to 3 enemies at once, so we get big kind of AoE damage, and also make them bleed. Bleeding meaning that they take 2 slashing damage at the start of each of their turns and have disadvantage on Constitution saving throws. This can help us shut down spellcasters while also attacking a wide range of enemies. It just felt like a nice, interesting option that kind of fits the theme of the build, but in addition to this is also going to synergize with some abilities we'll be getting later, so stay tuned. At Barbarian, level 4, we get to grab another feat, and at this point, it's entirely up to you what you want to grab. I did take an ability score improvement to max out our dexterity, as that did feel pretty good to use. It's going to help our AC, it's going to help our attacks and damage. It just felt like it made the most sense to just bump up just everything here with our dexterity. So yeah, I think this is a solid option at this point. At Barbarian level 5, we're not only just going to get extra attack, which we absolutely want, so again, level 9, probably where you want to respec, as well as we're going to be getting fast movement, giving us even more movement speed. We are very, very fast on this build. At Barbarian level 6, we're going to gain another Rage Charge, allowing us to rage more times per long rest, as well as we're going to be able to pick an animal aspect. Now, there are a couple that I think could work really well for this build. The first off is the Honey Badger. Oh no, not the Honey Badger, where is it? I'm trying to find the one that, oh yeah, well there's the Elk that can give you extra movement speed, which is actually kind of cool, and your allies as well. There was another one that worked with, oh yes, so you can get the Tiger, which gives you an additional strength modifier to attack rolls against bleeding targets, and proficiency in survival, although our strength modifier isn't really great, but if you decide to build this build with strength, maybe you're using strength potions, this could work. Stallion is another interesting option. If you dash, you gain temporary hit points equal to twice your Barbarian level, giving you way more tankiness. So if you have a way of dashing, maybe you got the rogue levels with this build instead, then this is definitely what I would recommend if you go down the rogue route. But the thing I went with is of course the Wolverine. If you attack a bleeding or poison target, you inflict Maim on it for 1 turn. Maim reduces the target's movement speed to 0 and gives them disadvantage on dex saving throws. This is pretty powerful. It completely locks down enemies who are bleeding, and since you can make 3 enemies bleed at once with Tiger's Bloodlust, that's potentially 3 enemies that just are not moving. This is a very, very fun and powerful ability, which I absolutely recommend for this build, but again, you have a few other interesting options as well. Moving on to Barbarian level 7, we're going to get Feral Instinct. You gain a +3 bonus to initiative and cannot be surprised. With our high dexterity, our Dread Ambusher feature, and this, you are guaranteed to always go first in combat. Every single time. Again, these abilities just synergize in weird ways. It's very, very fun. And finally, at level 8 of Barbarian, we're going to get the Landstride Difficult Terrain, meaning that difficult terrain no longer slows us down. It's just kind of a nice little cherry on top. It's not a huge thing for us, but with all the movement speed that we have, it's nice to know that it will not be impeded. We also get to choose another feat at this point, and yeah, well, other than our Wisdom, which again is going to get bumped up by an item, all of our stats are basically exactly where we want them. We don't need Charisma too high, but if you wanted to bump that up to a 14, you could. If you wanted to bump up your Wisdom by 2 points to make it a total of 16 at the end of the day, that can also work. Constitution could also go for a buff if you want a little bit more of that, but really you can just pick any feats you want here. Want to dual wield stuff that isn't light? Go for dual wielder. If you want to go for the, let's see, what else do we even have here that would be good? Martial adept could work, mobile if you want even more movement speed. You could go for the, tough feat, which is actually what I took in my testing, because it just gives us a really nice, solid 145 hit points. I absolutely recommend that. If you have the, Tasha's Feet mod installed, you can go for Slasher. Shadow Touched also feels nice on this build as a way of bumping up our Wisdom and getting the invisibility spell, which plays into the build very, very nicely. Slasher, as I mentioned before, can also work. Fighting Initiate if you want another fighting style. There is just so much you can do here. Savage Attacker also works, since we're going to be making so many attacks in a turn. Any feat here that you can think might be useful is completely free to take here. Again, I took Tough in my testing because I really liked the extra HP that it granted, so that's what I'll be showing off for this build. However, you are completely free to take anything you want here, even Dungeon Delver, if you're feeling a little bit zesty. And that is the build. What you're going to be getting out of this is just, well, you're probably one of the most tanky, mobile, but also just kind of interesting builds I've made. The combination of Barbarian's ferocious attacks with the stealth of Gloomstalker just feels so fun. You get to be this weird blend of this, like, shadowy, you know, like, character, you know, the typical kind of stealth archetype, but also just being able to, when you do attack, just be so vicious and bloody and just filled with malice that enemies fear you. It's so fun just have this idea of this character who will just step out of the shadows, instantly kill somebody, and then look at the others and just go crazy. Like, instead of zipping back into the shadows, they just charge in. Like, it's such a weird and interesting, like, character sub-archetype, like, that is supported by the playstyle that we have. And again, I found that the actual gameplay loop of, like, you know, attacking stealth, like, in the situations where you can, just felt fun. Even if it's not really, like, mechanically giving you a massive advantage, it just, the way you play the character just feels so cool in the moment. And again, you have a ton of extra utility. That movement speed is great. You know, turning invisible is always fun. You get to play as the face of the party, even with Speak with Animals as well, with that charisma and those skill proficiencies that we have. Like, everything just kind of blends together in a nice way. Some of it will feel like a bit of a jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none situation. You're not as good at stealth as a full-level rogue, for example, with expertise. You're not as good at, you know, frontline attacking as somebody like with Great Weapon Master, but you are an amazing tank, one of the best I've made, with the high AC and the high HP, and again, the freedom of customization that this build will have, which will come more into play with the equipment that I'll get into in a minute, you just have a lot to work with. And again, the flavour of this build and kind of the lore behind it is just one of my favourites that I've ever done. But I won't string you along anymore. Let's talk about the equipment. So, this is where a bit of the variance comes into play with this build. For my kind of Act 3 weapon of choice, I went with the Belm. This is just a pretty solid weapon. It's going to give you access to Whirlwind attack once per short rest to allow you to attack a bunch of different enemies around you. It's a +2 scimitar, and also again this ties into the lore of the Harpers, and again if they're like directly tied to Jaheira in some way, it kind of makes sense for them to pick up this weapon somewhere along the line. But you're also going to get Perfectly Balanced Strike, which allows you to, every turn, attack as a bonus action with the Belm, or whatever main hand weapon you have, if you want to play with those shenanigans. Basically, this just makes it so that you don't actually have to dual wield to be able to use a bonus action attack. Obviously, I've made my case for why dual wielding still kind of works, you know, with how some of our features work with Rage and all that. But if you wanted to kind of, when you respec, change from 2-weapon fighting into into dueling to make better use of this strategy and maybe ditch the offhand weapon, you absolutely could if you wanted to. Overall, I really like the Belm for this build, but you guys would probably go for something like Duel's Prerogative or whatever, even though we're dual wielding, you know, whatever. You guys can kind of pick whatever you like here, but I really like the Belm for what we have going for us because it is a very strong weapon. In our offhand, though, we have the Assassin's Shortsword, which is mainly here to give us advantage on stealth checks, but it is still a solid +1 offhand weapon. That advantage on stealth checks is going to feel really, really nice for all of our shenanigans, so I wanted to grab it here. For an early game weapon, though, I forgot to place it in my inventory, unfortunately, but I did actually grab the Speedy Reply Scimitar, which gives you 2 turns of momentum after landing an attack with it, and of course momentum increases your movement speed, which just felt right for this build. But again, this build can take advantage of lots of different weapons, so feel free to choose whatever you like. Knife of the Undermountain King works. Like, there's just a bunch of stuff you could grab, so again, feel free to pick whatever you like there. For our bow, an early game bow that you can grab is the Bow of the Banshee. On a hit, possibly inflict Frightened, and gain a 1d4 bonus to attack and damage against frightened... I completely messed that up. Basically, you gain a 1d4 bonus to attack and damage rolls against frightened creatures. Now, the Frightened status condition itself is also really good because the target cannot move, and the Frightened entity will also have disadvantage on ability checks and attack rolls. Now, obviously this works with the bow itself, and it's nice to still have a ranged attacking option. However, this actually works with any weapon attack, so any weapon attack that we inflict with our 2 main weapons as well also has the chance to inflict Frightened and gains those same bonuses. So just having this in your offhand, in your range slot even, without any intention of using it, is still going to give us the benefits. And I really like the idea of incorporating fear into this build. Again, the idea of someone striking from the shadows, but also this tough and relentless warrior that will attack the front line. That's going to scare the crap out of people. Imagine some tanky, near-immortal warrior that can suddenly disappear on a whim. That is going to scare somebody pretty damn bad. So the Bow of the Banshee feels perfect on this build. And in a similar vein, our headpiece for Act 3 is the Bone Spike Helmet. Whenever you rage, hostile creatures within a 3-meter radius must succeed a Wisdom saving throw or take 2 to 8 psychic damage. The targets receive half damage on a save. This also gives us a +2 to Intimidation, as well as the Menacing Attack action. Every turn, there's no short rest requirement on this, you basically get to do an attack that just deals extra damage and can possibly frighten targets. This is borrowed from Battlemaster Fighter. It's a slightly weaker version with the extra damage being slightly less, but it's free extra damage on one of your attacks every turn with a potential status effect as well. And the hilarious thing about it is this, like, whenever you rage thing, like doing psychic damage, right? Think about it. We're going to be attacking from the shadows, getting at least 1 attack off first, and then raging after that attack. You realize what we've just done? We've created a jump scare in Baldur's Gate 3. Because, you know, they get frightened, they take psychic damage, it's all well and good. But again, I love that +2 to Intimidation for the Barbarian's checks as well. So fun. This was too perfect for this build to not include. But for the early game, I recommend the Haste Helm, obtained very, very early on, and at the start of combat it gives you momentum for more movement speed, so you can just get where you need to be immediately. Moving on to the cloak, you actually have a few options here. We have the Shadeslayer cloak, so that while hiding, the number you need to roll a critical hit while attacking is reduced by 1. Since we have the ability to hide as a bonus action, you know, turn invisible, yada yada yada, we can basically give ourselves a higher chance to crit fairly frequently, so this synergizes quite nicely with the rest of the build. However, there are a couple of more options. There is the Cloak of Displacement to give enemies disadvantage on attack rolls against you. This can help counteract the downside of Reckless Attack as well, but also the kind of like stealthy, blurry nature, almost being like semi-invisible, kind of fits the theme of the build as well, but it's not overly necessary. Now, if you do decide to play this build as a Dark Urge instead, obviously that gives you the Haunted One background, so you'd have to figure out some of the skill proficiencies yourself, but you could go for the Deathstalker Mantle. After you kill an enemy, you become invisible. Very fitting for the build. I don't really think this is a Dark Urge build though, but if you did go down that route, for Deathstalker Mantle, it's absolutely worth a mention. Moving on to the armour of choice, we do have the Armour of Agility here. I know this is kind of a boring option, but it is going to give us a +2 to our saving throws, which is nice, adds our full dexterity modifier to our armour class, so that's a +5, as well as this armour does not impose disadvantage on stealth ability checks. Now this is entirely optional. There are a few different armours in the game that I would say work quite well. The Elegant Studded Leather also gives advantage on stealth checks, meaning that you can change your offhand weapon to something else, and also gives you a usage of shield once per short rest while, and again, unless patch H changes this, reaction-based spells can be cast while raging, so shield will work while raging. It would also give you an even higher bonus to your initiative, but at that point it's just like overkill. But I kind of like the Armour of Agility more for this build because the saving throws actually feel really nice here for those damaging spell effects, so I quite like the Armour of Agility a bit more here, but you can totally change it up if you want. For your early game armour option though, you can gain a +1 bonus to stealth checks with the Spider Silk Armour. It does also give you advantage on con saves, but that's not really relevant to this build. This is just a cool early game drow armor that you can kind of have that will just feel right for the build and just looks really nice. This is actually Minthara's starting armor, so you can get it fairly early just by defeating her. But overall, I do think having the Armour of Agility in the late game is definitely the way to go. Moving on to our gloves. This is an early game option, the Gloves of Missile Snaring. Now again, this kind of fits into that kind of unstoppable immortal attacker vibe, where this allows you to intercept missiles from ranged weapon attacks, reducing their damage by 1d10 plus your dexterity modifier. Because we have such a high dex modifier, we basically become a monk, being able to completely deflect missiles, which is absolutely insane. So if we've got a bunch of ranged attackers attacking us from a distance, we can just go for like a flurry of slashing attacks with our dual weapons and just cut up all the arrows mid-flight so they don't even hit us. Like, the imagery of that feels so cool. Like, imagine this. Okay, so you're an archer, right? You shoot down this enemy who's attacking your friends, and they just slice the arrow away, fade back into the shadows. You have no idea where they are, and despite the incalculable distance away from that you shot from, they still appear right next to you. Like, holy shit, that's cool. Like, this character is awesome. And finally, for our boots, we have the Boots of Speed. Overall, there wasn't really a choice, like a solid choice for the boots in my opinion. Anything can kind of work, but the Boots of Speed are just a solid early game option that give you the ability to dash as a bonus action. And when you do so, your movement speed doubles, and enemies have disadvantage on opportunity attacks against you. Overall, fairly solid, just gets you where you need to go in a pinch if you really cannot use all the movement speed that we already have. You can cross the entire battlefield, no problem, but feel free to slot whatever you like in here. Moving on to the accessories, you have a couple of choices here. First up is Khalid's Gift. This is the item that's going to bump up our wisdom to a 14. It's also going to give us access to Aid, which will give us 10 extra healing. So at the end of the day, with this plus our tough feat, we're going to have 155 hit points, which just feels extremely nice. Obviously, again, this ties into the lore of like Jaheira and being like close to her in some way, like her apprentice, like I said. If she passes this down to the player, which I think is kind of fun. But again, if you kind of want something that's a bit more generic, you can go for the Amulet of the Harpers, which again fits this build quite well. Gives you access to shield once per long rest, so again, you can cast that while raging until Larian says otherwise, and you also gain advantage on wisdom saving throws, which feels pretty on theme for this build, so either or works. Moving on to the rings, we have the Shadow Cloaked Ring. When the wearer's weapon and unarmed strikes deal an additional 1d4 damage against lightly or heavily obscured creatures and creatures made of shadow. A lot of the times we're going to be fighting enemies in darkness because that is our preferred state. Not darkness the spell, just like general darkness and shadows, whatever, because that's how most of our features work, and when we do, we're going to get a bit of extra damage, so might as well have this here. And finally, the Ring of Free Action. You ignore the effects of difficult terrain, which our level 8 Barbarian feature already lets us do, but this also prevents us from being paralyzed or restrained, which is huge. Again, the idea of being this fighter that has a high amount of maneuverability is always really, like, kind of stifled by things like maimed from the Steel Watchers, you know, paralyzed or restrained from, like, ensnaring strike and such like that. This ring just says no to all of that, allowing you to move wherever you want, whenever you want, regardless of the situation. I love this ring, and I just think it's such a nice quality of life feature to have on the build overall. But yeah, That is everything mechanically for the build, so let's go over the visuals. For my camp clothing, I am once again using Fear Taylor's camp clothing mod, because it is just the best one, and it's available on all platforms. We are using the Fear Taylor 6 Armour, which gives us this absolutely awesome, like, kind of shinobi look, which is really, really cool. The default color of, like, green and brown as well on the armor actually fits really nicely for, like, the kind of ranger build as well, but I've colored it in the Besheba dye, which gives it this amazing purple, like black with like a tinge of red in places as well, that just fits the build so nicely. Oh no, sorry, that was the Leviatar dye, but I also wanted to show off the Besheba dye because it gives us this purple and gold look, and I couldn't actually decide which one looked better. I feel like for the stealth aspect of a Leviatar with like the darker colors does work better, but I do also love the look of the Besheba dye as well. But again, the Leviatar dye kind of giving us that darker color with the like slight like purple and red and like the bit of the shininess as well. I think this works better, but I also do like the Besheba dye as well. So both of these are really, really good for fashion. But yeah, that is the build, and overall, again, I just love the way this build feels from a lore perspective, from a gameplay perspective. Just everything about this build comes together so nicely. It has a ton of customization with like the weapons you can choose, the armor that you want to use, whether you want to use unarmored defense, medium armor, whatever. You get a totally free feat that you can use for whatever you want, which is very rare for my builds. Usually they're very, very specific. Just being able to do whatever you want with it is so, so nice. It gives you a ton of freedom. And yeah, just the way everything synergizes together. Like, literally, we created a jump scare in this game that does psychic damage. I don't know. I just feel like this whole build is extremely fun, and I feel like there is like a lot of things you can do. And again, I just like the kind of backstory and the lore as well. I'm gonna keep going around in circles, but this build is just, it's actually, I thought this was kind of it's kind of whatever type build, but when I actually put it together and then thought of the backstory and all that, this has quickly become one of my favorite builds that I've ever made. And funny how that always seems to be drow builds. I might have a preference. But yeah, I mean, thank you all for watching, I guess. I mean, I haven't really been able to upload much recently. I'm kind of taking things slightly slower before patch 8 comes out, where I plan to go much more, like, in-depth with like videos and such, and just make a bunch more, obviously, because that's going to be a huge update. And also, if you probably couldn't tell by the way my voice has been kind of fluctuating, I've been ill for like the past 2 weeks. You know, my job kind of makes that happen quite a lot, so my voice has been kind of going and coming and going. And those of you who watched my last video will have pointed out that because my nose was completely blocked the whole time I was recording, it made my voice sound very, very strange. So hopefully I sound a bit better in this one. But yeah, I think I'll stop now before I do lose my voice again. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.